Well, I'll kick things off. My name's Spencer Rosie. I chair the Orkney Heritage Society. And so, anyway, welcome to the launch event for the Orkney, the new Orkney Antiquarian Journal Volume 9, which commemorates the victims of Orkney's witchcraft trials. Rather appropriately, I'm actually sitting about 100 metres away from Galahad, the place of execution of many of the women accused of witchcraft. Now, before we begin, there are a few announcements and thank yous. The speakers have agreed that the event should be recorded, so if anyone is uncomfortable with this, please keep your mic and the camera muted. There will be the opportunity to ask questions after each speaker, so it would be greatly appreciated if you could keep your microphones muted until each speaker has finished and you want to ask a question. We've all had to learn new skills in these COVID-19 times, and this is my first Zoom meeting, so please bear with me. I would like to thank all the contributors to the volume, as well as James Irvine and Ragnhild Ljosland for editing. Orkney Heritage Society started publishing the new Orkney Antiquarian Journal back in 1999, producing a new volume about every 2 to 3 years. Now, maintaining a high academic standard has been a key aim, which I think has been successfully achieved, considering the number of times articles from the journals are referenced by historians and researchers. The present volume continues the high standard set, and having studied Kirkwall merchants in the 16th and 17th century, I have certainly learned a lot from reading this volume. Now, I would also like to thank Lucy Gibbon for hosting and setting up this meeting, Hayley Green for organising the tickets on Eventbrite, and Andy Hollandrick for putting the link on the website and advertising on social media. I must also mention the Arcadian for once again producing a quality publication, but at a more competitive price, which has allowed us to sell this volume at a very reasonable price of £15. Copies of the journal can be obtained from the Heritage Society's website. They're also available in the Arcadian bookshop. But anyway, enough of me. I want to hand you over to Professor Liv Willumsen from the University of the Arctic, all the way in Toronto.
Good evening. Good evening from Tromsø. First, I would like to congratulate with this new issue of New Orkney Antiquarian Journal on the witchcraft trials. I have followed the work laid down by Orkney Heritage Society and other contributors, first with the Orkney Witch Memorial, where I was present in Kirkwall during the opening, and now with this theme issue of the journal, and I'm very pleased to take part in this event. My interest in witchcraft trials started in the early 1980s, born by the women's movement and its commandment that female researchers should lift forth women from history. And here witchcraft trials came in as a suitable area of research because of the absolute majority of those accused of witchcraft were women. I started to read the court records from witchcraft trials in northern Norway, in Finnmark, and was hooked. The material was so exciting and rich. There was so much to get to know about learned people as well as common people's way of thinking and understanding the world. I have continued to read these court records for 40 years now because I found the topic important and always new things to discover. I would like to pose two questions during this talk. The first is, why is it important to study witchcraft trials? The second is, why is it important to build memorials to the victims of witchcraft trials today? So the first one, why is it important to study witchcraft trials? To study witchcraft trials is a way of uncovering a part of painful history, injustice effected by a powerful apparatus. This is not a part of history that we should be proud of. It is not about victorious persons, but about victims. Still, it is important that knowledge about the witchcraft trials is lifted to the fore in the public sphere so that it becomes visible and possible to reflect upon and talk about. With regard to knowledge of witchcraft trials and documentation, here attempts of the 17th century state to build archives comes us to help. The suspected persons were persecuted by the courts, and we know about the trials today because court records were written telling about what happened in the courtroom. From the beginning of the trial, and then on to the interrogation, the verdict, and the sentence. The persecution of alleged witches is a historical phenomenon covering many aspects. It deals with the role of the state authorizing persecution. It deals with the role of local courts holding trials. It deals with the role of the church and its preaching. It deals with the role of power exercised in the courtrooms, where an accused woman always was met with a wall of powerful men. It deals with fanatic ideas about the devil and his servants and the evil deeds they could perform. It deals with fear of tragic accidents, sudden sickness, and death. But for me, most of all, the court records are interesting because they deal with the voices of women from the common people, voices that are not often heard in 17th century historical documents. These voices of women are possible to listen out, particularly in the confessions given during the trials. The voices of the women are of utmost importance because we are in a period of history where women from the common people did not often lift their voices in the courtrooms. Through the confessions, we get an insight in the mentality sphere of ordinary people, the way they speak, which is very valuable. It gives an opportunity to get a glimpse into the minds of 17th century people, what they believed in, their thoughts, their imagination, how they understood the world. My second question is, why is it important to build memorials to the victims of the witchcraft trials today? Witchcraft trials took place all over Europe and 400 years have passed. I would like to approach this question by referring to my own work with Steilneset Memorial in the north of Norway in Finnmark County. 91 persons were executed during the Finnmark witchcraft trials. 77 women and 14 men. They were persons brought before the local courts, sentenced to death and burned, lives that ended too early and in a frightful way. It is important to build memorials to these victims to show them respect. The work with which memorial has to do with dignity. My contribution to Stalnes Memorial is that I've written one text to each of these victims, given each of the women and men a name and given them a voice. By showing them as individual human beings, they have been showed respect. However, the work with which memorials is also a reminder, a warning. A memorial to witches is a signal to visitors that the historical phenomenon of witchcraft trials once took place. At the same time, it is a prayer that such events should never happen again. And here we stand at a paradox, because the mechanisms that we see taking place during the historical witchcraft trials we can see also taking place today. Over the centuries, there are links to our time. What is clear to me is that the same mechanisms that were active during witchcraft trials are the same that we can see today in persecution of women due to fanatical ideas, in the result of torture, in the use of pressure over time to make persons confess. The core is fanatical ideas effectuated by powerful persons. The same mechanisms that proved efficient during witchcraft trials in the 17th century can be seen implemented today. Thus, it is important to build memorials to the victims of the witchcraft trials today, on one hand, in order to point to show what happened in history some centuries back, and mark a full stop to this event. On the other hand, a witch memorial also points to the nature of witchcraft persecution, centered around fanaticism in the hands of powerful persons, which still are contemporary challenges. I would like to close by sharing with you some reactions from visitors at Stalnes Memorial in Finnmark. Since 2011, when it was opened, I have got numerous responses from visitors to have been there. There is one word they frequently use. They say they were touched, in Norwegian, berørt. This has led me to reflect upon what it is that happens when you as a visitor meets such a dramatic event as the witchcraft trial. What is it that touches the visitor? At Stalnes, there are two buildings, a long, narrow building with a corridor inside, and on both sides of the corridor we have the text panels of the 91 victims. You cannot go through this corridor without noticing that there were many people executed. Then there is a glass pavilion hosting an art installation, which is a chair with a burning fire in the middle. So what is it that touches the visitors? Is it the drama? Is it the fire? Is it the injustice? Is it the fear that they must have felt? Or is it something in the effectuation of witchcraft trials that also brings forth an uncertainty? At Stalnes Memorial, this uncertainty is emphasized in the art installation in the glass pavilion, where the visitor walks around a chair with a burning fire, and the image of the visitor is reflected in one of the mirrors above. The visitor is drawn into the art installation, so to speak. Then the question comes up to me. If I lived in the 1600s, would I then have been a participant in the persecution, or would I have been just a spectator? Thanks for your attention.
Now, does anybody have any questions? Okay, well, we'll move on. I'll introduce Dr. Ragnhild Ljosland of the University of the Highlands and Islands Archaeology Institute. Let's say a few words. Raggy.
Thank you very much, Spencer. We could do questions for both Liv and me at the end, perhaps. Yeah. Okay, so before I start, I would just like to thank everyone who's been involved in this project, and today especially the 7 contributors to the volume that we're launching, and James Irwin, who has edited it along with myself, and also Lisanne Henderson for reviewing it for us. I think you're here today, Lisanne. So that's been great. Thank you so much, everyone. Now, I'm really encouraged. There's been a growing interest in the witchcraft trials lately. Our memorial here in Orkney is just one of several, and there's been calls even for a national memorial to the people who were executed as witches across Scotland. So we want to commemorate all of those who were tried for witchcraft in Orkney. That is the 71 that were already known about from the work of Ernest Marwick and the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft. Plus, I can now reveal an additional 9 who came to light in the course of this project, thanks to James Irwin and his archive work. So we now have a total of 80 victims from the time period 1594 to 1708. 80 people, all accused of the most hideous crime of the day, witchcraft. And it was regarded as so terrible that there was a special law against it, the Scottish Witchcraft Act, passed by Parliament in 1563 and repealed in 1735. And the punishment for witchcraft was the harshest imaginable. It was death, but also burning. So, coupled with the Christian faith, this was a punishment that deprived you not just of your life, but also of your afterlife. You can't be resurrected. So it's death and eternal damnation. How could a thing like this happen? I've been trying to understand it. And there are several aspects to this question. Liv has already spoken about some of them. First, there's the aspect of collective panic. So that answers the question, why witchcraft in particular, not something else? So what the crime is depends on what people are most scared of collectively at the time. And in the 17th century, that was the devil. And the devil to these people, the devil was real. His demons were amongst us and had unquestionable influence over people who weren't careful about not letting him in, especially women, the weaker sex. The witches were thought to have derived their magical power from the devil. So we can see in some of the trials that they were thought to meet up with him and have sex and dances and orgies with him. Barbara Bundy, for example, who Liv Willumsen here has done a very good close reading of the trial of. Barbara was accused of attending a dance with 99 witches at Munes, it says. I think that's Mones in Hoy. And Jonnet Irving, who was tried in 1616, has supposedly met with the devil on a hilltop between Harry and Rendell, where the parishes meet there. And we can see her there with the devil, and it says that the devil has taught her to wish ill on someone by looking at them with open eyes and praying to him for their illness. So the devil and the fear of the devil was palpable. Notions of cause and effect were rudimentary. With the Enlightenment in the 18th century, these fears started to melt away, and so did the witch trials, which makes these accusations seem very strange to us today. They're not within our intelligibility norms at all. Today we fear other things, for example, terrorists. So the next question is, why this particular person? None of the people who were burnt for witchcraft had done anything that was out of the ordinary. What they did was the same as everybody else was doing too. For example, Helen Hunter had read bubbles in milk to find out if the milk was bewitched. Jonnet Reed had said to a man who was bothered by his nightmares about his dead wife that he should go to her grave and tell her to lie still. And she also cured sciatica with hot stones and water. So it's the kind of folk medicine and divination rituals that have been done both before and after the period of the witchcraft trials, and by most people in the community during them. So why were some individuals singled out for punishment? Now, this is the hardest bit for me to understand. In many cases, it seems to be because they were vulnerable in some way or lacking support. They may have been poor, widowed, they may have been strangers. We all know how difficult it is to be a new person at school. So the accused witches who were not executed were often banished from the parish, meaning they would arrive among strangers and then have to beg to survive, which they were not allowed to do outside their home parish. So they were not welcome and soon attracted murmurs and new accusations. So we see that in some of the trial documents, the victim is noted as being a vagabond or homeless. And the victims, or some of the victims, may have been a wee bit different in other ways too, perhaps not the best social skills, perhaps moody, perhaps a bit odd, just odd in one way or another, or not the type who easily makes friends and is instantly popular at a party. So to withstand accusations of witchcraft, you need a lot of support from influential people in the community. Peter Marshall showed this very well in his article in this volume. He looked into the case of Marjorie Papley. So if you know Orkney, you'll hear from the name that she was from an old and prominent Orkney family. She was the mother of James Bakey, who you might know as the Laird of Tankernes and the owner of the building that's now the Orkney Museum. And James Bakey mobilized his network and defended his mother effectively too. As far as we know, Marjorie was investigated, but there's no record of her being sentenced or executed. But a homeless person, a poor widow, an older penniless woman from a croft, or an oddball lacking in social skills, doesn't have this kind of support that Marjorie had. And there's therefore nothing she can do to defend herself. You can't defend yourself in any case because the accusations are not rational. So Marion Cumlequy, for example, in 1643 was accused of going to somebody's house and 3 times anti-clockwise around the fire. And this supposedly caused a neighbor's bare meal to rot and his oats not to grow. And she also stared at a man while he was sowing his seed, and that caused a bad harvest. So there's no way anybody could prove of this or disprove a connection there. So the crime can't be investigated in any rational way. It comes down to what witnesses say, what light they paint you in, and how they sway the panel of judges, and your lack of popularity and your lack of support. Which brings me to a bigger question of why, what are the psychological mechanisms at work in witchcraft trial processes? And that's difficult to grasp fully, but the first thing we can observe is that it is an unusual form of aggression, in that it is aggression addressed from a group to an individual. And the accusers and the witnesses who testified against the so-called witch, and the people of the community who lined the streets of Caracol as they were paraded past and up to the execution site at top of Clay Lone. The folk who cheered and watched in awe as the witch was strangled and burnt. They were not bad people. Believe me, they were not bad people. They were ordinary people. They were ordinary people caught up in a destructive group dynamic, which is something entirely different. And to understand group dynamic, we have to go and look at our animal nature. So it was one of the other contributors to the volume here, Corwin Broch, who put me on to this. Corwin, a couple of months ago, talked about a scene that he had witnessed among some crows. I'm sure you're all familiar with battery hens and the way they can peck each other to death. Well, what Corwin said about the crows was even more chilling because it seemed so orchestrated. He had witnessed how a large group of crows had formed a circle and punished an individual crow in the middle of it. And then they had pushed the crow into the middle of the circle and attacked it and severely wounded it. And then they had expelled the injured crow, shunned it, ostracized it, and left it to live or die. So when I started looking into this, it turns out that the same kind of behavior can be found among other flock animals too, for example, wolves and chimpanzees and humans. So risk factors among animals are if the individual is new in the flock, like that woman who's been banished from her parish, or if the animal is ill, injured, or weakened, like the old poor widow, or if they are in a confined space, like those battery hens. Among humans, it could be like, for example, a shortage of food, bad years, failing crops, short supplies, or it could be living pent up in little croft houses, sharing with many, many people in a life situation where you can't just pack your bags and leave. So a further risk factor is when something has happened to destabilize the flock, like when the old alpha has died. So it's not a coincidence, I think, that the witch trials start here in Scotland at the time of the Reformation. It wasn't the fault of the Protestant or Catholic Church at all. It's simply about the upheaval, the destabilization of old power structures. Like that upheaval in itself releases the potential for aggression. So the individual singled out for attack may or may not have done something to annoy the leader. If it's a wolf, it might have failed to show submission. Or if it's a human, she may have pissed somebody off, like Maribel Cooper, who Jocelyn Rendell writes about in this volume. Maribel had somehow pissed off her neighbors, David and Margaret Mowat and Bercy. And now she's being blamed for the death of their calf and how the other cow wouldn't get pregnant and many other things. And then the next thing the flock of animals needs is a signal, a nod from a leader. So if an alpha or influential member of the group signals that this monkey here now is singled out for attack, then even the monkeys who were until then its friends and even relatives will join in attacking that monkey. So here in Scotland, that authority for aggression came from the king, James VI, who wrote a book called Demonology and instigated the first high-profile witchcraft trials at North Berwick in the 1590s. Orkney then followed suit. So locally, the authority, the nod, would come from ministers, church elders, sheriffs, sheriff deputies, the kind of people who have to be seen to be doing something about this problem of witchcraft that the king has identified. So when monkeys and people are given to know by someone in authority to turn on their friends, they will do that. And it has nothing to do with being a bad person. These are ordinary people who will maintain and believe that they were acting for the best and had no choice but to do what they did. And that's the difference between individual psychology and group psychology. So the psychology of the group leads individuals to act in ways they wouldn't have done individually, like in the famous Stanford prison experiment. I'm sure you were all just waiting for this to come up. I know it's a cliche, but it's a really good illustration of that mechanism. Once the finger has been pointed, the rest of the community are caught up in a vortex. They can't choose to speak out in support of the witch, because that means they risk having the finger pointed at themselves next. As a witch in league with the devil, suddenly the witch's problem may become your problem, and that would be terrifying. It takes someone who's very secure in their position, such as James Bakey, to resist the vortex. The witch is completely isolated. And now the community starts remembering. They cast their minds back 2 years, 5, 10, 12 years. Older women have a whole lifetime to draw from. Remember, what did she do that time her neighbour was ill? Janet Forsyth, the storm witch from Westry. In February 6 years ago, she cast an illness on Thomas Port, then cured it again and got paid in corn. And at midsummer that same year, she went to sea and took a canful of salt water to take the profit, the butter, from John Harkis's kye. And 4 years ago, she was angry with James Rendell when he wouldn't give her food. And the next day, one of his cattle took ill and died within the week. So all the fond memories or neutral memories that folk may have had of Janet are now transformed into condemning evidence. It's like when a marriage ends in a bitter divorce. Now the spouses think back. They have always hated each other, it seems now. And they can remember many evil things that the other has done from many, many years back, which they didn't think to mention at the time. So rumors spread about the witch and become critical judgment among the gossipers, which generates more and more negative memories. More and more people are caught up in the gossip spreading, so that bystanders become participants and the size of the aggressive group grows. Soon they all share a single negative opinion of the witch and all agree on a storyline and interpretation of her guilt. They are rewarded with approval from the authorities. And if the witch tries to resist this, she only digs herself in even deeper, like a fly wriggling in a spider's net. In some of the trial documents, I've seen the accused raging, swearing, cursing, and threatening, giving themselves out to have real magical powers and threatening to use them against their accusers. And sadly, that just condemns her further. So the witch is no longer a human now. She's literally demonized. She's a witch, a universally abhorred category. She doesn't deserve to be treated humanely. She deserves to be exterminated. That's for the best. To be paraded through the street up to Gallowha and strangled and burnt in a spectacle for the aggressive crowd. And this is why we should remember them, to give them their humanity back. To remember Janet and Marble and Barbara and Jonet and Helen, just folk, 80 humans who may have been difficult oddballs, but they were not in league with the devil. Thank you.
Thank you, Raggy. That was brilliant. I'll open it up to questions or comments. Or
yeah, we have one from Swain here on the chat already. He says, it's interesting to think that modern systems of justice try to avoid the worst excesses of the practices, including bringing in everything a person has done in retrospect. Raggy is speaking about, at least in some countries, the basic legal system is based, however imperfectly, on principles which should not allow this sort of persecution. That's a good point, Swain. We have better systems now to mitigate it in formal court cases, at least. Everyone, if you want to speak, you have to press the unmute button at the bottom left to unmute yourself, and then you can ask. And there's lots of experts around here, so you can ask to anybody.
one aspect that I found really fascinating was the political element. After the Orkney Rebellion, 1614, that they used the witchcraft trials to try and control the population and make out that the rebels were working for the devil. Which I found that quite fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. I find that absolutely fascinating too. It was Ashley Angus's article and Peter Marshall's article read together. It struck me that witchcraft is something that you can get a woman for when she's being difficult, no matter what the reason is that she's being difficult. So the people that Ashley wrote about had supported the Kirkby Rebellion in 1615, and they had been quite vocal about it, and for example shouted on the street in support of the rebellion. Then when the authorities are going to silence them, they need some way of silencing them, and then they drag out this witchcraft law and use it to silence them. Very, very fascinating. Helen says, absolutely, I hadn't realized how much in Orkney witchcraft trials were tied up with the major political events of the time. That's true, Helen.
A question from Karen Gardner to everyone. Besides Scotland and Norway, where else have memorials been recently established?
Is there anybody in the audience here who would like to answer that? Because I've only paid attention to Scotland and Norway, I'm afraid.
Two answers have come up here, one for Forfar and one for Paisley.
Yeah, Forfar and Paisley are both in Scotland. Yeah, so those are, Forfar was one that inspired our one, the Orkney Memorials wording, because we put on ours just folk. And that was inspired by Forfar's just folk, we put it in Orkney dialect. And we felt that those two words were so powerful because they were, of course, just in the sense that they hadn't done anything wrong. There was an injustice done to them, and they were just folk. They weren't devils or demons or in league with them or anything. Yeah, it's a Forfar. And there's a new thing in Dunfermline, I think, isn't there? There's somebody from Dunfermline who's connected here now. I saw earlier. There's a witchcraft trail. Is there a memorial there too?
Can I speak?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm from Dunfermline. They have just done a witch trail. I'm sure most of you have heard of Lilias Adey, and she walked between 3 villages. It's not in Dunfermline. It starts at Torryburn and then goes to Valleyfield and Couras. But it's 3 discs on the walk, and it's a memorial to her, but also to the people that were accused of witchcraft in that area. I think there were quite a few in Dunfermline and Fife, the west coast of Scotland at this part. I think there's been quite a few people tried for witchcraft. So yes, there's a trail.
Thank you for telling us about that, Elaine. And this trail opened only a few weeks ago, didn't it?
It was only about 2 weeks ago. Yeah, it was only about 2 weeks ago. So it was well attended as well, which was good.
That's great. There's things happening, and I've seen news in the media about the calls for a national memorial and a formal, it wasn't apology, it was something else.
There are 2 ongoing things that I know of. The woman that actually spoke at the opening of sorry, I'm not used to speaking to all these people. The woman that spoke at the opening of the ceremony is, I think it was Claire Mitchell. She's a QC, and she's looking for a pardon, and I think she's looking for it might be a memorial, but I got involved at the beginning of Fife Witches, Remembered they were called, and that was to try and get a memorial locally, but now it's become a national thing. They've changed it into a national thing.
It was a pardon, yes, that was it. The difference between a pardon and an apology is a pardon would be a legal thing that pardons somebody for a crime they were convicted for, but then you sort of have to agree that it was a crime in the first place, which I don't. Now, Lisanne Henderson is saying here about the witchcraft museums in Iceland and England. Did you want to come in there, Lisanne, and tell us more about that?
Hi, everybody. I look like I'm in a witchcraft museum right now in my dark little study here. But no, I just, there's quite a few witchcraft museums dotted about. There's a couple in England. The famous one in Boscastle, which is definitely worth, it's been there for a long time. It's definitely worth a visit. The one in Iceland, I'm just struggling to remember the name of the place. I just visited it about a year or 2 ago, up in the kind of northwest of Iceland, and it's small, but it is worth a visit for us who are kind of hardcore witchy folk. And of course Salem, a couple people in the chat have mentioned that the entire town is dedicated to remembering the Salem witch hunts. I'm sure others can, and there's a new one just opened in Denmark as well. They just had their opening. There might be somebody here who knows more about that.
Oh, sorry. The Doreen Valiente Foundation, which has all Doreen Valiente's books and tools and everything. They held an exhibition a couple of years ago, and I believe that they're looking for an actual location for what they call, I think it's something like the Council for Witchcraft or something, but they weren't looking for a permanent place that can be used as a library and museum, to which people could then, practicing witches such as myself, can then deed their witchcraft property for the elucidation and interest of everyone.
I think I've seen photos of some of the things they have in the Icelandic witchcraft museum, and the thing that made an impression on me was the Nåbruk, I think it was called, or something. It was the dead body trousers. It was like the skin of the bottom half of a dead man that was supposed to do something.
I don't have anything like that.
No. Here in the Kirkwall Museum we have a witch's spell kit and a witch bottle, which I thought was quite good for a small museum like ours.
And can I ask a question? I read about a theory recently by Ronald Houghton who argued that Highland regions with a strong Gaelic population really believed in the second sight and fairies and so on were maybe less likely to hunt witches. And the kind of theory that he suggested was that the sort of belief in fairies was a kind of like a vaccine against witch belief because they were kind of more, I guess, forgiving of interaction with magic. Do you think that's true, or do you think if there is less deaths in this region, it was due to another reason?
I think there's definitely regional differences, but what the cause is more difficult to say, because there's also other differences, like how the church was organized up along the east of Scotland, and in the Northern Isles it was organized in presbyteries, whereas the Catholic faith was more widespread in the west, so you don't really have the same power structures there. But I wouldn't say that's the cause either, but it might be a factor. And only Zan, you have looked into the difference between Highland and Lowland fairy beliefs and witchcraft belief, haven't you?
Yeah, I did quite a while ago in one of it's in one of Julian Goodair's publications as an article. Just in short, I didn't actually find huge differences in terms of belief between the Highlands and the Lowlands, in terms of what people are actually, how they experience witchcraft or what they thought witches did. But it was slightly more emphasis on things like dreams was coming out of Highland culture than you would get in the Lowlands. A lot more emphasis on second sight, things like that. But it in terms of, like, there wasn't really sharp distinctions, not from what I could see. I mean, of course, people might have a look in more detail at these cases now and see something that I missed, but that's just what I had seen at the time.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions?
Hey Raggy, it's Vernon. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, I've got a question for you. I've been listening to a lot. I've been trying to ask for ages, so I might ramble a little. So just with Alison, and just so you know, this is nothing from Alison. This is all from me. So right. So I've got a few sort of observations. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was rational thinking. There must have been rational thinkers throughout all of history, going back to the earliest of the most thoughtful thinkers. Somebody must have thought rationally but been too frightened to say anything, because I picked up on your comments about fear, and people would have been frightened to say anything. So that there's this idea of there must have always been rational thinkers. The other thing is that what parallels or observations would you make about evangelical USA? Because they will still have massive belief systems, medieval belief systems that they would use to persecute a minority group that didn't fit or didn't work with their agenda. Because there's always a set of rules in a group, isn't there? If you don't conform to the group, well, I'm sorry, you're not in. If you're going to join the group, you've got to you have to work with our agenda. The other thing is, what about other belief systems? How did they persecute people? Did they label people witches, or did they have another name? Why the word witch? I mean, you could call me a witch. I would say, what do you mean a witch? What's a witch? What are you calling me? Because I dissent, because I choose not to do something like you do, or do something you don't like, you're labeling me a witch. Are there other belief systems that would have labeled other people different things? What about Islam? How do they persecute witches, or how do they label people that don't conform to what they think is a norm, or lots of stuff. I'm finding this really fascinating. I thank Alison for introducing me to you all. I hope I don't mess with her studies. But there you go. So a few observations. I'm enjoying this immensely. Thank you. So a
Thank you
few
very
comments
much,
there.
Vernon. And Alison, you can rest assured that I'll not be marking anybody in this
Okay,
session.
sweet. Great.
Yeah, but that's an interesting observation and question, Vernon. I would prefer maybe not to talk about evangelical USA at this point, because I feel it's important not to condemn or judge other groups. But what I would like to comment on is your observation that there must have been rational thinkers at any time in history, which I'm sure you're correct in saying. And I think what we must recognize is how profoundly shaped we are by the time and the society that we live in. So a belief in the devil in the 17th century was rational to them. Fran was also raising this point in the chat. I see that the fear of the devil is real. So trying to find out who might be in league with the devil is a rational thing to do when you're in that mindset. And we're kind of blind to our own mindset now, because to us, everything that we do in our time and place feels rational to us. And it's when we encounter other cultures in other places of the globe that we come to see ourselves in the difference. So that if you find yourself, for example, on Borneo or in Afghanistan or somewhere that is very different to 2020 Britain, then you start to reflect on why are those differences there? And maybe I've been socialized into the culture that I live in. So for people who believed in the devil, that seemed like the absolute most rational thing you could do. And seeking out people who are in league with the devil is as important as seeking out potential terrorists by surveillance and searching through internet conversations and all the things we do today.
I just wonder about how much science has had to play with our rationale and our reason.
Yeah, that's right.
The...
So rationality changes in the 18th century with the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
When there was a really big shift in people's thinking, and modern scientific methods were starting to begin to develop more. And as Julian there observed, we enter into modern society. So the Reformation era is kind of between medieval and modern. It has a foot in each, so it's a very difficult time to live through. It's a liminal time where you're not quite medieval and not quite modern. But as soon as the modern ways of thinking, that big paradigm shift has happened, then the fear of witchcraft also starts to slow down and calm down. Although we see in, for example, oral history recordings from the 20th century that people still have stories to tell about witchcraft in their community, but the panic is over. Don't know, Julian, would you like to comment here?
Yes. Yes, hello. Yes, can you hear me or see me? Yes. Yes, the end of witchcraft or witch hunting is one of the fascinating aspects of it. And yes, I agree that part of it is the rise of modern science, which tends not to be interested in demonic causation and tends to see these things as alternatives. You also have the end of the movement that the Reformation was the beginning of, the movement to purify religion in society and to get everyone believing and behaving in the same way. And once you start to agree that you can believe different things, and everybody does not have to worship in exactly the same way that the government does, then the pressure drops in ideological terms. You mentioned James VI earlier. He claimed to be an absolute monarch, divinely legitimated. And so, he personally was the enemy of the devil was personally the enemy of him. And, when the state is legitimated by that kind of ideology, witch hunting makes sense. But when people can believe different things and the state doesn't mind quite so much, it's not of so much interest. It becomes irrelevant. It becomes old-fashioned. It doesn't necessarily become sort of wicked, but we just lose interest in doing it, and that's what seems to have happened in the late 17th, early 18th century. It's a slow and gradual process. Many people today are still thinking in magical ways. They're still attributing causation to things that science wouldn't really agree with. But the authorities are not demanding conformity in the way that they did in the 17th century, and that seems to me to be a crucial point. And the rise of modern science is behind that, but the demand for ideological conformity seems to be the crucial thing.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Hey Raggy, I've got one more thing, if that's okay. Sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Some years ago, I took an interest in the witchcraft accusations against children in Africa. I was involved in a small charity there, and that's still very visceral. It's still very real. People believe children are demonized. They're killed. They're hunted. They're still persecuted to this day. So it hasn't gone away, has it?
No, it hasn't. It hasn't, and all the more reason to talk about it and be aware of it.
Yes, yeah, good. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Vernon.
Hi, sorry, can I just go back to something that Elaine said earlier on about the accused witches trail in Couris, Torryburn and High Valleyfield. That was put together because of the story of Lilith Adey, who is believed to be the only witch in Scotland that we have a grave for. So I'm part of the group that facilitated the launch of that. And one of the things that we hope to do is raise awareness, bring a national monument for all the accused witches of all of Scotland together, but also extend the accused witches trail initially around Fife, but hopefully Scotland, so that we do give back these people their humanity and their dignity back and tell the stories. And this has just been absolutely fascinating and really interesting, and I'm really happy that you posted it on our group page, so I knew it was happening. So thank you, Ragni.
Thank you. It's great to have you here, Sheila. And it's also great to see everything on your group page to know about what's going on. Yeah.
Yes, get a plug in there, or I wouldn't be a good chairperson. It's the Remembering the Accused Witches of Scotland. We have a Twitter page and a Facebook page, and we're always looking for people to join us.
Yes.
So a little plug there. Thank you.
Thank you. I was just about to ask you what it was called, Sheila, so thanks.
Yeah, we're a constituted group now. We've been doing this through lockdown, and we're almost finished our application to become a charity to be able to raise money for all this. So
wonderful.
That's fantastic. Well done.
Thank you. Wow, it's a lot of hard work by a lot of people that than just myself. And a few of them I can see their faces on this thing tonight as well, so that's really good too. Liz, hi Liz, is waving at me.
I would like to come back to something Marita Luck has posted in the chat. She says, I think we need to distinguish between the learned elite and what they believed, and how this corresponded with the older beliefs of so-called common folk. And I think that's a really important point you're raising there, Marita. Would you like to say more about it? You might not have a microphone. Anyway, I think Marita's point here is very valuable because there's a difference between the learned elite, like the ministers and the folk. And I think it's in the clash between the learned elite and the folk beliefs that we see these accusations. So folk beliefs are things like you can cure by heating up 3 stones in the fire, putting them in water, and then rub the patient with the water, like using the 4 elements. Or salt is good, so you can take a cow into the sea, let 3 waves wash over her, and that'll help her. It's that kind of thing. So we have all these folk practices in folk medicine that have been around for centuries before the witchcraft trials and have not been illegal up until that point. And then we have the learned elite with their ideas about the devil, their Christian doctrine about who the devil is, what he does, and how he has demons working for him that are everywhere and that you can encounter anytime. If you're not careful, suddenly there'll be a demon there trying to tempt you into doing wrong. And it's when these 2 things come together, they form a lethal mix. So, for example, folk belief will tell you that there are fairies, and the fairies live out in the hill, in the knowes. The fairies can steal milk from cows and from lactating mothers. They can swap babies for their ill, sickly fairy babies, that kind of thing. And then the church tells you about demons. And now when they're put together, fairies and demons are the same thing. So Barbara Bundy, for example, or Janet Drever from Westry had both seen fairies. And Elspeth Rioch, that took part in the Kirkwall Rebellion, she had seen a fairy in the form of a black man. So then when people with education, theological education, hear about fairies, they hear demons. So demons and fairies become one and the same. So all these folk beliefs are suddenly transformed into something very dangerous and illegal that can be used as evidence in a witchcraft trial.
Can I come in again, Raggy?
Yeah.
What about class systems then? Because I picked up on what you were talking about, the elite. So I was watching a nice documentary with Alison the other day on medieval kings, queens, royalty, you know, elite. And so what about the relationship between class system and persecution? So
Yeah.
what about if you? I mean, right now I think, if I'm not mistaken, we've got a classification of about 7 in Britain. I mean, I don't know who does this, but you've got the elite, you've got the established middle class, you've got the technical middle class, the new affluent workers. I mean, but in some cultures maybe where there isn't such a class distinction between peoples, is there as much persecution? I don't
That's a big question I've not looked into at all, but there were definitely classes in 17th century Scotland, yes, and the higher classes have a greater chance of resisting accusations, like Marjorie Papley, for example, who had a rich and powerful family around her. She was able to not be convicted, probably, at least there's no record of that. She seems to have been defended quite energetically and fiercely by her family. And I think those who are members of the elite, whether they're merchants, so that they are in a financial elite, or they're clergy, in a kind of intellectual elite, they both have enough power to repel any accusations that might come their way before they come to anything.
I was kind of not thinking in that direction. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it from that point of view. What I was thinking was maybe if you look at the Aboriginal sort of kinship relationships in Australia, Aboriginal Australians, whether they have the same persecution of people as maybe a system or a culture that has got a class system. So not somebody who is in an elite class that is protected, but where you've got a class system that might persecute the lower classes to make them conform. Where, you know, I'm throwing out here because I don't know about Aboriginal the system, but it seems to me that maybe a simple culture that doesn't have as oh God, what am I looking for? A dynamic class system as distinct classes might not have as much persecution.
You're thinking of a more egalitarian.
Yeah, if you've
society.
not got as much
I can't
different,
answer that. I
no,
have
it's just,
no
yeah.
idea. If anybody else can, you're welcome.
Yeah.
From my own experience, and this is in East Africa, so it's not Aboriginal people at all, but the assumption of there being egalitarian systems is sadly mistaken. They're very adamant in enforcing uniformity, and so people who deviate from the norm are quite likely to be ostracized or condemned. Now, this is just in my, as I say, in my own experience of what I've seen and what I heard speaking to police from the local area, that there are norms within these groups that are so tight that it only takes a minor deviation for someone to make themselves a victim. So there's not a class society, but there are people who have more say and people who have more power. Coincidentally, they quite often happen to be men as well, but there is definitely a persecution of those who go against the norm.
That's really interesting. I studied maths a while ago, and when you were speaking there, I was thinking about something that's called a Bell distribution. So most people are, I don't know, 5'10". You always get some exceptions that are 3'2", and you always get those exceptions that are 8'5". They're always persecuted. Wouldn't it be lovely to live in a world where you've got this Bell distribution where nobody was persecuted? A straight line distribution. Sorry, that's my mother. I'll just turn that off.
Okay.
Yes, I wonder if I could come in on this, Orkney, would that be possible?
Hey, yes, I couldn't quite hear you there, Julian, but if you would say something, yes, please.
Yes, I would like to contribute to this because this is an interesting discussion, and both the common folk and the elite are concerned about witches in early modern Orkney, Scotland, Europe, but often in different ways. And what we often find is that the common folk are concerned about one witch at a time and are concerned about magical harm done by one person, one neighbour. But they don't necessarily want these witches executed. And time and again in the trial records, you get stories of bewitchments that happened a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And what happened a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago was that the person who was bewitched went to the alleged witch and said, look, can you sort this out? Can you lift the bewitchment? Can we reach a reconciliation? And these reconciliations are what keep these societies going. Nobody needs to be executed. And it's only when the authorities start to become interested and they start thinking that there's something going on here that somebody will be arrested and this will be treated as a criminal act. But the norm for peasant society is to believe in witchcraft, is to believe in magical harm. But the way you deal with it isn't to execute the witch. It's that you negotiate with the witch, you reach a reconciliation, and that you rehabilitate the witch, and the witch learns, not to fall out with her neighbours again. And people are always falling out with their neighbours, but there is, as well as the constant falling out, there's a process of constant reconciliation. And so it's only once the authorities are concerned that you get large-scale executions.
That's a great point. So, for example, the Moats in Berkshire who testify against Marable Cooper, they might not have wanted Marable executed, but once the sheriff or the kirk elders come and ask them, they have no choice but to tell them everything they know. Do you think?
Yeah, shall I come back on that? But briefly, just to say yes, that you know, some of these people who testify may not think I want this person executed, but you know, once the wheels start turning of the judicial process, you know, they have to come in and testify what they know.
Yeah, that's what I call the vortex. It's unstoppable.
Yeah.
Who was it that was coming in there?
I was me, Joyce. I was actually going to agree with Julian, worked together for many years, and I was going to follow that up by saying that the relations are quite interesting because we're focused on the accused as being in some way an innocent victim and the powers all with the state who are persecuting. And I think what Julian was saying is that the relationships with the suspects have been there for many years. The suspects actually has been powerful because they've been a person who has some influence, a reputation within their community, both feared but at the same time respected because of their potential knowledge. So I think it's an interesting dynamic that often we assume so much about those being named as being completely innocent, and maybe, you know, that the power they had is an interesting aspect too, that they were often part of that dynamic of playing up, perhaps exaggerating knowledge, skills, because they gained something from it themselves. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in that connection, it's also interesting to note that when the law against witchcraft was repealed, it was replaced by the law against giving yourself out to be a witch.
Hi, Raggy, just one more. I listened to what you said there, and absolutely, it's always replaced by something, but it's all to do with norms, what we call norms. Hey, I mean, it's, and oh my goodness, for all of my life, it's always the people that dissent that are always the most interesting. They're the people that change the world, and so it's not normal people that change the world. I'd be careful what I say. I'm just talking mathematically. So in your Bell sort of distribution, it's always, you know, it's always the people on the outside that change things.
We need people of all kinds.
Well, yeah, but it's
yeah.
I don't know a society which acknowledges everything. There's always some conformity. There's always an agenda. There's always a set of rules. There's always the group theory. You if you want to join this group, you have to conform to these rules. That's it. That's it. Whereas, you know, yeah, that's the way it's always seems to have been. So
it feels to me that we're approaching the end of our conversation here today, doesn't it, Lucy and Spencer? But I think we'll give people a chance to raise any last points that haven't been discussed yet. No? Okay, can I just end my bit now by thanking everybody again, and special thanks to everybody for coming. And it's absolutely great to have so many people who are passionate about the witchcraft trials gathered in one video conference. I think we can say that the coronavirus has brought us something positive tonight.
Spencer, you're mute.
I thought I had. Right. Thank you. Yeah, just to reiterate, the echo what Raggy said. Thank you all for attending and for your contribution tonight. It's been a great event. new experience for me, but I hope you'll all get a copy, get it through the Orkney Heritage website. There's some fantastic articles in this, well worth the read. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Oh yeah, how do we get rid of it? Okay, great. Thank you.
And thank you, Liv, as well, for joining us from Tromsø. And thanks for your great talk.
Hi, Liv.
Yeah.
Thank you.